welcome to my studio. I'm Lydia Naomi, and today you have come to the right place because we're going to hack my Milkmaid dress. You can get the pattern, it's linked below, and there are multiple tutorials with it from advanced to beginner, so definitely check them out. Today's sponsor is LDH Scissors. Let me just show you. A little sneak peek. How beautiful are those? How beautiful. LDH sent me 3 of their scissors, a snips, a rotary cutter, and fabric shears. And ever since then, I've been using nothing else. First of all, they are high quality. They cut fabric like hot knifed butter. They're super easy on the eyes. And there's a whole bunch of other bonuses about them as well. So LDH Scissors specialize in high quality fabric shears, pinking shears, thread snips, rotary cutters, and other sewing tools. They have a 10-year warranty and sharpening support, and they're family owned and female led. They also donate 5% of every retail order to Women's Shelters Canada. They are Canada based, they are Canada designed. Oh, Canada! So if you want to treat yourself to some gorgeous quality scissors, look no further than my description where their website is linked. Let me tell you, your fabric cutting was here. It's gonna be here. Off the charts, my friends. So without further ado, let's get into the dress tutorial. To add the button extension, I start by tracing out my center front panel of my bodice. This part is on fold, so just remember it doesn't have seam allowance. I have removed the 1/2-inch seam allowance at the front and at the bottom. I'm going to remove the seam allowance. So now I'm going to line this up along my seams, right there, and line this straight in line with the center front. I also just remembered I need to take seam allowance off the top as well. Extend this center line up, and I'm going to go 1 inch down from the top, and then I'm going to mark in 1/2 inch on the bust cup from the edge. I'm going to draw a nice curve to follow the bust and connect it to the bottom. Now I'm also going to use my tracing wheel with the sharp points to trace right through the paper to copy this onto my center front piece. I'm tracing in this area. This is now my center front piece, and I just need to add on the seam allowance again. I still have the seam allowance here. I didn't need to remove that, so we'll leave that. And then I'm just going to add seam allowance all the way around here. And also here, because this was on fold, but we're going to add seam allowance there instead. Okay, there's the front piece with the 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. Now let's add the seam allowance to this piece. So this is my new line. I need to add seam allowance there. And then this is where I want it to end, so I'm going to draw a new line from the top edge. And then I'm adding my 1/2 inch seam allowance to that. And that is going to be my new piece. That's my new bust tie casing, this black dotted line. So there we have it. We have these two together. When it came to extending the waist to hip length, I measured down 9 inches from the bodice, which is my waist to hip length. At this point, I measured out a perpendicular line that was my hip circumference divided by 12 for the center front and center back panels, because those pieces are actually half of their full width, and this is a 6-panel garment. I divided my hip by 6 for the side, front, and back panels. I added about 1/8 to the back and front side panels for ease. I removed the center back seam allowance so I could cut that piece on fold, and extended my added seam allowance to the center front of the extended waist to hip portion. I also added some length to the sleeve, but later took it away, so it was kind of unnecessary. I kind of made this dress up as I went along, so there are other simple pieces such as the skirt, the extension of the button placement, and the back top facing, but I will show you as I go. To create this dress, you'll want a whole lot of self-cover buttons. I actually ended up using 30. You'll want a 1/4 inch elastic, prepared elastic button loop, about a yard, and if you can get the 1 inch spaced one, do so. I couldn't find it in my local shop, so I just have to make do with what I have. You want some light fusible interfacing, you don't need much. Then about 3 or so yards of 54-inch plus wide fabric. I'm using this bright rayon. Get yourself some matching thread, and of course you'll need my pattern, which is linked in the description of this video. I'm working with a size 8 for your reference, and of course you will have to make the alterations to the pattern as I have shown you. This Milkmaid pattern was free for a limited time. It's no longer free, but it is an affordable price on my website. Also, I just want to give you a heads up to subscribe to my newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new promos like free patterns, so definitely do that. Don't miss out. With shifty fabrics like rayon, I love to get out my cutting mats and rotary blade. I love this LDH rotary cutter because of the way the blade is concealed between the two plastic guards.
Oh, it's like butter.
It doesn't touch the blade, making it dull over time, unlike every other one I have ever used. And let me tell you, it's a very chic experience cutting with this blade. This is where we come to creating the 3 long rectangles for our button extension. First, I fused a chunk of fabric, then I cut out 3 pieces, the length of the front bodice piece and the width of 1.5 inches. I cut out 3 more off camera that were 10 inches in length for the skirt portion of the buttoning. Then I cut out my skirt pieces, which are just great big rectangles. The skirt portions are twice the width of the area that they are attaching to. When it comes to cutting out a proper right angle square or rectangle in rayon, you can use the thread pulling method. So measure the length of your piece and remove some of the straight grain yarns from that area so that you can get to the cross grain yarns. Pull one of them and pull that yarn across the entire length of the fabric. Do this everywhere that you need to cut a straight line, and you should have a beautifully straight piece of fabric. There we have all the pieces cut, with Pepper just making herself at home as per usual. Make sure that you cut the amounts as shown. Then you can also overlock pretty much all of the vertical seams and leave the bust cups and horizontal hip seams unserged for now. The bust cup is a bit different than my original, so we're going to start by facing the pieces right sides together and sewing the top. Then open this up, iron it, and turn it out. Sew 2 rows of stitching 3/8 of an inch apart, or about 1 centimeter, and 1/2 inch from the top of the bust cup. Once that is done, feed through an elastic. I used a 5-inch elastic for this size 8. Make sure you secure it at both ends. Then sew a double stitch along the bottom of the bust cup with your largest stitch so that you can gather it. Then take your front bodice pieces and sew them together at 1/2 inch right sides facing. Leave the center open. Now with right sides together, attach your bust cup to the cutout, starting the top edge of your bust cup 1/2 inch from the top of the center front of your bodice. Pin, 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 pin. Adjust the gather on your bust cup if need be, and you are good to sew at 1/2 inch and also overlock. Done! And it's beautiful if I do say so myself. I know yours is going to be gorgeous too. Don't you worry about a thing. For the back, I did basically the same thing, minus the bust cups, of course, and I'm just pressing these seams open. Then I'm facing it right side to the front bodice and sewing up the side seams. 1/2 inch babies, 1/2 inch seam allowance. That's 13 millimeters exactly for those of you who prefer metric. At this point, I realized I wanted to clean finish the back neckline instead of folding it over that 1/2 inch. I decided to create a facing. So I added fusing to a 3 or 4 inch thick strip of fabric. This will keep the back from stretching out with wear. Then I traced out the back carefully, placed it right side to the back bodice neckline, and sewed and understitched across the top. Then I flipped it out and stay stitched it to the armhole area. That basically means that the stitching is within, not outside of the seam allowance. To further secure it down, you can also sew it to the seam allowance of the bodice seams. And that is our bodice complete enough to move on to the sleeves. I started by sewing with my widest stitch length along the edge of the sleeve cap. Then I gathered this just enough so I could fold over the outer edge to create a casing for our elastic. I pinned it in place and sewed it up. Then facing the underarm seams right sides together, I sewed those up as well, pressing them open. You should always press as you go. Your garment will be easier to work with and look so much better in the end. Just my 2 cents. Attach your sleeve underarm to your bodice underarm. There is a double notch on the sleeve that indicates that it is the back side of the sleeve, so that side should coincide with the back bodice. Then sew these babies up. Then I'm taking 2 10-inch pieces of elastic and feeding it through the channel that I made on the sleeve caps. I'm going to secure both ends with a stitch, and that will be the sleeve cap complete. So I am opening my bodice and laying out my 3 rectangles kind of bunched up. The small rectangles at each front portion and the large rectangle at the back portion of the bodice. To gather, crank that stitch dial to its highest length and stitch 2 rows along the top edge of each rectangle. Gather each piece to match each portion, and when this is done, I sew up the side seams of the skirt at 1/2 inch before attaching it to the bodice. So that's done. Now add the bodice to the skirt, right sides together, pinning everything in place and matching side seams to side seams. Then sew at 1/2 inch, matching the seams. I like to keep the gathers on top to make sure nothing gets bunched or caught. That is the skirt portion complete. And you'll also notice that I top stitch the seam allowance up so that it would lay nice and flat. Now let's tackle that front button closure. I've added a 1-inch strip of fusible interfacing to either side of the center front to stabilize it. I should have done this right away at the beginning because the rayon likes to stretch out. I've already sewn the extension pieces together. There should be 3 altogether, and 1 is folded in half lengthwise. Also notice that I have overlocked just one side of each strip. The button loop will be sandwiched between the front bodice and the strip of facing, so I'm going to place the button loop edge right against the seam line. The seam allowance along the center front, if you recall, is what? 1/2 inch. It's 1/2 inch everywhere. So from the raw edge of the facing strip, I'm marking that seam allowance. I take the end of my button loop and roll in the end. I place it 1/2 inch from the top and 1/2 inch from the raw edge. Then I lay the loop edge of the button loop tape right along the marking. That way it gets concealed inside the seam allowance when you sew it. And then pin it down all the way. Then to secure it together, zigzag it to your piece. I like to pull it taut as I sew so that it doesn't bunch up my fabric. I kind of actually sewed it wonky, so I had to take that area out and fix it. Otherwise, it would be popping out of the seam and just not look pretty. For the button extension piece, I'd wish that I'd made that little folded piece a little bit wider. So instead, I just placed the raw edge of the folded extension piece 1/4 inch away from the raw edge of the facing strip. That would give me more once I sewed it at 1/2 inch. I pinned it in place and then stay stitched it close to the edge. When I started sewing it, I realized that I should have finished each end of the extension piece with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and then placed it on the facing. That would make it end up being a 1/2 inch from each end and allowing for seam allowance and allowing it to pop out. And that's what you will see when I turn it out. Okay, so both of these are now done, so let's apply them to the dress. I put the button loops on the left side of the dress, or my right. I lined up the top to the top and the skirt seam to the facing seam and pinned everything in place. I started by sewing across the top, making sure to avoid sewing in the top of the bust cup ruffle and the top loop. Also, as I sew down the button loop, I push in every other loop. That way my loops and buttons will be 1 inch apart instead of sardined together. I didn't show you the sewing part for some reason, but basically I sewed it together and also stitched the seam allowance to the facing strip, kind of like an understitch, and you'll see I did a wider stitch placement to catch the rejected button loops in there to keep them from popping up. The other side is basically the same deal except less bulky. I understitched this one close to the seam as a normal understitch would look, and you can see the finish ends of my extension piece. The dress is finally ready for the buttons. I lined up the button loop side over the extension and marked where my buttons will go with a disappearing fabric pen. As I mentioned, I had to make 30 buttons, so I made a 1 inch diameter circle out of cardstock and traced around it 30 times. Then I cut them out. Then I took a needle and thread and sewed a running stitch around the perimeter of each circle. A running stitch is basically just an in and out motion with your needle, super easy. I left a good tail of thread where I started and finished so that I could pull the edges of the circle, making a little sack for the dome of the button. I popped the little button in and tightened the thread, kind of like a drawstring. And when I snapped on the back of the button, I used 2 screwdrivers to pop it in securely. Then I just sewed up the completed buttons to the dress with a quadrupled thread. This step took me the longest of all, but I watched glow up while doing it, so it was really fun. I'm not loving everything that's going on. The sleeves are too long. I think if I either shorten them or change this to straps, I will like it a little bit better. So, as I mentioned, to make the sleeve look better with this style of dress, I shortened it again and created a simple casing for a piece of elastic at the hem. Super simple. And finally, to finish off the front skirt edge and hem, I just double folded it using my baby hem foot, and it was all ready to wear in the morning sun.